My name is Jeremy. It's really good to be here. I'm in this lecture filling in for Fernando Perez, who unfortunately couldn't be here, as I'm sure you all maybe heard this morning. And I can't possibly do justice to anything he would have done or anything he would have showed about the Jupyter Notebook for obvious reasons, because he was basically the original developer of it along with Brian Granger. But I did want to come up with a few things to say and kind of talk through about the Jupyter Notebook. Not necessarily showing kind of cool things you can do with it. That might have been the title of this talk at some point. There are a lot of cool things you can do with it. There are also a lot of things online that show you cool things you can do with it. I encourage you to check. If you just Google, because I did before figuring out what to talk about, I just Googled cool things to do with the Jupyter Notebook. There's like 20 blog posts, and they all have really cool tips and tricks. I wanted to talk about something a little different that really comes from basically observations over the last few years in my own group about ways that we have used the Jupyter Notebook, and I think uses of it that are fantastic, and also uses of it that are sort of illustrative of it serving certain roles and not other roles in sort of normal scientific analysis workflow. So I basically want to talk through that a little bit. It's sort of conceptual ideas about how to do kind of data analysis in general, how to structure your code base, especially as things get complicated, which is something we think about a lot. So this is going to be some mix of sort of high-level thoughts about that, sort of advice. I'll give some examples. I'll show you some examples, all from our own group, so both good and bad things I think we've done with the notebook. And yeah, hopefully be useful. We can make this super interactive, so just fire questions and we can bounce ideas around. Maybe just to start, who or to what degree are you familiar with the Jupyter Notebook already? Who's used one? Okay, great. So we're already, who does a lot of their work with it? Okay, cool. And is that more like data analysis stuff or visualization stuff, or just kind of a mix? And all kind of neuroimaging? I don't have a great sense yet of whoever. Okay, so fMRI stuff in the notebook. Awesome. A lot of your own code or other people's modules, other people's libraries?
Mostly my own.
Most of your own code? Okay. Yeah, cool, that's great. So maybe I'll walk through something I think about a lot that I find pretty interesting, just at a high level about how we sort of do data analysis. And this, I made a very simple slide for it. I think we all, and definitely my group, spend a lot of time thinking about what's on the board right now, which is just the process by which we go from something like raw data to something like a scientific result. And it seems really simple because it seems like it should just be a couple arrows and they get us from A to B, and it's really straightforward, and it's easy for other people to reproduce when we're done. But I think what everyone nowadays realizes is that in the vast majority of actual scientific work, and especially in domains of neuroscience that I'm used to, which I should say include I've done stuff, everything from fMRI to electrophysiology to two-photon imaging in the mouse, whole brain imaging in the zebrafish. So sort of the whole gamut of modern neuroscientific methods. And the vast majority of what I see in the world right now is something more like this. And this is just almost as a sort of ethnography. I like to go to labs and just look at what they do. And this is always what you see. If you just ask a lab, it's just kind of a fun exercise. Just take me through your pipeline. What does this, what does the lab do? It always looks something kind of like this. And these arrows involve maybe different little components for loading different kinds of data. Maybe there's some custom data format that the microscope in this lab uses that's different than the other lab. And then there's all these kind of custom components for different kinds of visualization, analysis, different libraries. The whole thing is a mess. And I've thought a lot about, I've become really interested in why that's true, and sort of what the problems are with this picture and what we might be able to achieve that's different. And I think one of the big problems is that if you have solved a problem somewhere in here that's really similar to what another lab has solved, or a problem that another lab needs to solve, it's really hard to take a piece from your solution and give it to the other lab so that they can solve essentially the exact same problem that you were trying to solve, using ideally the same code, but it just doesn't work that way. Because when we have these things where everything's kind of jumbled together and mixed up, it's really hard just to isolate. You can't just take one of these arrows and sort of hand it over to some other lab and just plug into their system. And to me, the big issue, or a lot of where this comes from, is that I think just philosophically, we tend to approach the problem of data analysis in the lab setting by starting to think about how to build a pipeline. And just talking to labs, this becomes very clear. So every lab will say at the very beginning, I'm going to build the data analysis pipeline for my lab. And it's going to take us deal with all the different data we have to work with, and we get all the different results that we need, and it's going to be great, and it's going to solve all of our problems. So that is great, because you will build something that works, and you can always build anything. This is one thing I've learned about software development. You can implement anything, especially with the diversity of languages and tools that we have available now. So you'll make a pipeline, and it will work. The problem is that if you just think about the pipeline, you're going to end up building something that only has very small pieces which are reusable or usable at all by other groups. And you're going to end up implementing things that other groups have already implemented, probably in a different way, and then everyone's going to be doing everything differently, even if we're all conceptually solving the same problems. So the picture that I really aspire to, and I sort of want us all to aspire to, is something more like this. Hexagons are cool for a variety of reasons, but in this case, I think just they're a nice illustration of the idea of basically trying to build or start not by building a pipeline, but by building small, composable, reusable modules, each of which solve some particular problem and solve it well, and that's all they do. And each module should have a fairly narrow scope. So this concept comes from, where exactly it comes from, you could say it comes from Unix. It's sometimes called the Unix philosophy, that you should sort of start by building small things that solve small problems well, and then build more complicated stuff out of that. And to be sort of concrete, if you're thinking about, say, fMRI or two-photon imaging, some of these modules might be things that load data from a particular format that's maybe specific to 5 different labs. But other modules might be image registration, and other modules might be some sort of signal extraction procedure, and so another module might be some machine learning algorithm, and some other module could be a visualization library. There are some differences across languages, actually, in terms of how modular or non-modular people think we need to be. So I actually find Python and a lot of the Python packages, to me, tend to be a little bit too big. I've taken a lot of inspiration from the JavaScript community. I encourage, actually, who here knows JavaScript? Or spends, oh, great, okay. So the Node.js community in particular has really embraced this. In some cases, they have embraced it, you might say, to a level of they go kind of all out on this philosophy. So just to give an example that was really I feel like everyone always makes fun of JavaScript because of this. But they have a tendency just to build lots and lots and lots of very, very, very small modules, each of which some of which might only be like 5 lines. And there was a crazy thing that happened this summer, and you're gonna think that this makes modularity bad, but it doesn't. There was a module called LeftPad. Anyone hear about this? All did. Okay, great. So there's a module called LeftPad, and what LeftPad did is it was about 8 lines of code. All it did is it took a string and then pad it with spaces on the left. So LeftPad is very descriptive. And it turned out that LeftPad was a dependency of, it was used by this other package, Babel, which was a transpiler for JavaScript, and that was used by a library called React, which is a front-end library developed by Facebook that's super popular. And basically, the guy, Azure, who made LeftPad, because he got in a dispute over naming with the package management, package registry for Node, decided to unpublish all his modules. He wrote a blog post saying, I liberated my modules. So because of really what I think is just a flaw in how NPM works, and there's a moral here, that resulted in all builds of Babel breaking, which then resulted in all builds of React breaking. So basically the whole internet went down for about 20 minutes the day that this guy unpublished this module that put a few spaces at the beginning of every line. So some people think that's an example of taking this idea too far. Maybe these modules shouldn't be as extreme as like padding something with spaces. On the other hand, there are a lot of things you can do that I think make this totally viable. One of them is having a really good package management system and lowering the barrier to making new packages. So NPM, the Node package manager, I think does this phenomenally well. After this LeftPad incident, they got rid of the ability to unpublish, which was really important, because one way in which this will break is if you can, if anyone at any point can just pull one of these from existence, then you have a problem. But basically, I think if you approach a lot of problems with this picture in mind, mind, and you're careful about defining really clearly what the sort of inputs to each module are and what the outputs to each module are, and you try to do that at the beginning, then you can think about sort of chaining together these things and building pipelines, which we do ultimately need. Every lab needs a pipeline. But the pipeline, you should think of it as being built out of small components that are easily reusable by other labs and are easy to understand. So that's sort of at a very high level. I take a lot of inspiration from, well, I said the JavaScript community in general. In particular, I really like this quote from a developer called Substack. So he says, when applications are done well, they're just the really application-specific brackish residue that can't be so easily abstracted away. All the nice reusable components sublimate away to GitHub, where everybody can collaborate to advance the commons. So Substack is definitely a proponent of this. In fact, if you go to his page on, I think this will pull it up, on NPM, you will see that Substack has written 747 packages. So that's Substack. He is a human, but he likes to pretend he's a robot. And these do all kinds of crazy things. You know, some of them are really simple. One of them almost equal. Just test whether two arrays are equal. No, just two numbers are equal. That's even simpler. There's stuff for audio processing. There's stuff for BitTorrent. There's stuff for image processing. Substack, this collection of modules single-handedly powers a pretty large fraction of a lot of the tool chains that most modern web companies rely on. So he's done a lot. And he's done it in a way that it's all built out of these small composable pieces that you can sort of grab and plug in. I would say the Python community could do a little more in the direction of modularity, like maybe not going all the way to the extreme thing of having a module to pad a string with spaces. But I think there are a lot of cases, and there's actually been some really nice recent examples. I should pull them up, but Jake Vanderplas, who's here at UW, recently just published a couple really nice packages. Each one was basically some little machine learning algorithm. So he had some method for local linear projections for doing dimensionality reduction. So he published a Python package that was local linear reduction or projections for dimensionality reduction. Some rules that I think about modules is that you want them to be really easy to understand. If someone comes and looks at your GitHub repo and reads the README, it should be really clear to them what your module does. You should have an example. We can get into this. It should be easy for them to find it, easy for them to tell what it does. It should have tests, and its inputs and outputs should be really well defined. And that's a pretty good recipe for making something that people are likely to want to use. Question,
so is the framework that you have, that you're envisioning, that modules can be recursively defined in terms of other modules? Because essentially, like if I want to do a web application, and I start with like a RESTful API, I don't want to cobble it together out of like 37,000 tiny modules. Right? I'd much rather go to README, which is like, this is in turn constituted out of tiny modules, right?
Absolutely. So if you start, what I like is the idea that everything at the end is built out of small pieces, but as you have those small pieces, you can start building things on top of them that add complexity, but also allow you to always drill down if you need to. So, you know, in some ways, like, why do I not like things like MATLAB or some of these kind of proprietary tools? It's that you don't have a way to drill down. You know, it might work for a large fraction of the things you need to do, but then the moment things stop working, you can't sort of drill in and say, all right, I want to figure out how that thing worked, and oh, that depends on that. How does that thing work? If you think about things this way, again, whatever language, nothing here is language specific. You know, it's great that if there's some algorithm in scikit-learn that you don't understand, you can drill down and figure out exactly what it's doing. If you build a modern web app, it is often, you know, you'll have like 30 of Substack modules will be a dependency. There's certain things that are really important in writing modules that are really required to make this kind of thing work. One of them is semantic versioning. Are people familiar with that? Okay, cool. This is a cool concept. It's relevant for, and I'm going to get back to the notebooks in a second, because it all kind of fits together. Semantic versioning is basically it's just a really simple standard for what version numbers should be, which, as you can imagine, in a world full of all these small modules that depend on each other, it's really important that we can talk about how they change as they get updated and how they depend on each other. So the idea of semantic versioning is that every module or every package has three numbers, X, Y, Z, and the third number, Z, specifies or increments when you make a change that, say, fixes a bug or changes something internally to the module, but it doesn't change anything about the API. So by that I mean anyone who has read your README and based on that comes out knowing how to interface with your module, what inputs to give it, what outputs to give it, what the methods are. That's sort of the simplest thing for most small modules. When they see that third number change, they can still keep using the module exactly as they were before, and nothing in their code should break. So we sometimes call that a patch change or a bug fix. The middle number is a little different. That implies, when you bump that there have been changes made that do change the API, but they do it in a backwards compatible way. So you might have added a new function, but you kept all the old functions working exactly as they worked before. The top number is when you make a change to the API that's not backwards compatible. So maybe you add a new function, but you also remove a function that was previously working. And what's really cool about semantic versioning, and again, if everybody agrees on it, which a lot of people have, if everyone uses this rule, then it's really easy to specify what our packages depend on. Because if I say package A depends on package B, and it depends on this version, or maybe the most recent thing up to this number, then assuming I'm using it in the correct way and it's been defined in the correct way, it should always work and it should never break. And if you need to, you can say only require that thing at a particular version. So this is, again, totally Python, JavaScript, doesn't matter. This is a really great practice for anything you write as a module that you want to publish and package. Give it a version, be consistent with the versioning, think about how the version changes over time. If nothing else, this actually, I think, forces you to think about your API a little more than you would otherwise. Because when you write a module, it can be tempting to just, I don't know, give it 10 functions or 15 functions, or maybe it takes 10 different inputs and you're just going to sort of deal with it. Whereas if you're using semantic versioning, you really have to pay careful attention to what you're doing and how you change things over time. Any questions about this concept? It's one of these things where it's really cool when it works and everyone does it. And if people start breaking it, then you have all kinds of messy situations. So what I'm going to do is basically, I'm going to show you some examples of Jupyter Notebooks, because I think Jupyter Notebooks fit into this picture in a really interesting way. And then at the end, maybe we'll go and show some examples of things in Python that I think are good examples of modules, and then even talk through a little recipe book that I have for what I do to write a module, which is really just based on things I've learned from all these people. But feel free to interrupt me. We can make this pretty free form. It's a small group. Question?
A couple of questions.
Great.
With all of these modular dependencies floating around, how does a developer focus on testing interactions across these modules?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the sort of naive, optimistic answer is that if each component is well tested in isolation, then and subsequent components that are built that maybe use other ones are also tested in isolation, then everything should sort of work. In practice, I think it does mean as what you're building becomes more complicated, the kind of complexity of the tests also need to become more sort of developed. You need to test a wider variety of inputs and outputs and sort of paths through the code. So I think it's sort of, that's one of the reasons I like writing small modules, because I don't think the testing is easier. We'll talk about testing for people that haven't thought about it a lot. Actually, there was a unit testing session today, right?
Later.
Oh, it's later. Oh, okay, cool. Great. You'll just be already. Oh, really? Oh, great. You'll already be primed. So I'll say some things that might not make sense, but then a couple hours later you'll just be ready. Yeah, I think the short answer is the smaller a thing is, the easier it is to test it. As it becomes more complicated, it's harder to test. It takes more work. That's why I like writing small things, but sometimes you have to write big things, and then you just have to sort of bite the bullet and do more systematic testing. Just to sort of follow that discussion for everybody, the really basic idea of a test is that everything we ever do when we're developing software and writing code and writing modules, for every piece of functionality that we write, we should have inside there another piece of functionality that tests that the thing we started to write is doing the right thing. So if you were to write a module that does addition, and it, say, adds two numbers, you should have a test that checks that when you give your function 1 and 2, you get back 3. That's the basic idea of testing. And that thing should actually be part of your code. It's sort of right there alongside your code. Every time you change anything to your code, you should run that test, as in literally run a Python file that executes it, and make sure that you get the answer back that you were expecting. I should say that when someone explained that to me for the first time, I thought it was crazy, and I was like, why would you ever do that? That sounds like such a waste of time, because you're literally writing twice as much code as you think you need. I can now say, having done it in a variety of kind of large-scale projects over several years, I was wrong when I thought that, and it took me about a year to figure it out. It makes an enormous difference. If nothing else, it makes an enormous difference to your own ability just to understand and keep track of what you're doing. If you write a little piece of analysis code and does something, it doesn't matter what it does, and you come back to it in a year, if you had a test, that's awesome, because you can be like, oh, not only have I hopefully documented something about what my analysis code does, but I actually have an example of what it looks like to run it on real data or fake data or whatever, and what the result should be. And that's it's almost self-documenting. You look at that and you're like, oh, I know what the thing was supposed to do. Whereas if you don't do that and you go back to look at your analysis code, especially if you didn't have a README or something, but even if you do, it can be hard to figure out what you were doing. And then even more so, if you now wanted to start making changes to the thing you were doing a year ago, and you want to make sure the changes you're making aren't breaking what the thing used to do, how can you possibly be sure of that unless you somehow, in some form, run something that tests that your code is doing what it's supposed to be doing? So tests are really cool. It's sort of one of those things where, kind of like version control, it seems like extra work until you start doing it, and then you realize all the enormous amounts of time and work and effort that it actually saves you. But getting there takes time. All right, so how does the notebook fit in? To me, the notebook is, the Jupyter Notebook is a phenomenal tool. We do an enormous amount with it. We've actually built some services that make it easier for people to deploy kind of notebooks on demand. I can talk about that if people are interested. The notebook is a game changer. To me, it's the most exciting thing is that I think it really gives a way to have a computational narrative that is just more interactive and more rich and more interesting than the vast majority of how science is sort of documented and produced and presented right now. If you compare, say, a document like this to a PDF in a journal, right? I think everyone would agree there's just an enormous amount of value in being able to jump in and play with code and sort of reevaluate things and look at outputs and look at inputs and sort of read text. So I deliberately brought this up. I should say all the examples I'm going to give, both good and bad, are from one person in my group. So and it's not even like I and he should share responsibility for all of it. In some ways, these examples actually show our own evolution internally in my lab of sort of how we think about the notebook and how we use it. So I'm going to have this one up as what I think is hopefully a good example. This other one I'm going to have up as maybe a not so good example. Or maybe at least in between. And one immediate way to recognize, to me, whether we're using the notebook well is just how many lines of code are in it. I think, I'll sort of give the answer, then we'll get into it. I think the best way to think about the notebook, not unlike that quote I gave from Substack, is to think of it as a fairly high-level thing that sort of glues together the use of a bunch of different components and modules and presents a narrative about what you're actually doing with those components and what you're doing with data. But in terms of actual code implemented in the notebook, the volume should be reasonably low. To me, the best possible notebook is one where you have some explanatory text and then you import a module and you use it in a couple lines to get a cool result from a bit of data, and then you explain what that thing was. And ideally, that module should have a few parameters so that someone can come in and play with it and make some changes. But in contrast to, say, a notebook where you are essentially coming up with, on the fly what you're trying to do and just writing an enormous amount, this, for example, a notebook that's just doing an enormous amount of coding in the notebook is, I think, it's not really, you can use it for that, but it's not really the environment in which you should be doing that kind of programming. And I wanted to talk about this because I see it happening a lot, and I don't really ever hear it talked about, but I very frequently see students, basically, in my own lab, other labs, who start using the notebook for prototyping, because it's wonderful for prototyping. I think if you just want to quickly be in a setting where you can like write a little bit of code, look at a result, plot something, it's wonderful. But what I see happening a lot is that people start using the notebook for that, and then it becomes the environment in which they do all of their analysis, and they just kind of keep going, and suddenly they have a notebook that has 20,000 lines of code. It's really hard to keep track within the notebook at that point what the sort of sequencing is. You end up with like function definitions that depend on things in earlier lines. You're not usually ever running it from the top, which is sort of the only way to make sure that everything depends on some previous stages in the right way. And it almost becomes like an IDE, or it's like a development environment. There might be things in the future, probably Fernando would have talked about them, I probably can't, that will be more like an IDE that are sort of based on this model. That could be great. I think the notebook as it is right now is a beautiful tool for sort of documenting and producing these narratives, but it's not the environment in which you want to be doing all of your code development, and it's not really how you want to be thinking about your code development. Because what very quickly happens is you end up with a notebook that has 8,000 lines of code, or 20,000 lines of code, and you know, in some ways, we're using this tool, we're using Python, we're using open source, we're using notebooks, it's all about reproducibility, but that thing is not really, you haven't actually really produced a lot that's reproducible. It's true that someone can come in and press play, and that's cool, they can always just run through the whole thing. But if I look at your notebook, and I'm like, boy, this thing, between line like 9,000 and 20,000 is a nice little, it sort of seems like a nice little self-contained bit of analysis code. I'd really like to use it in my project. What do? Do I have to like read through the whole rest of the notebook to figure out what you were doing up to that point? Do I like just copy and paste all those cells into some file somewhere? You know, what do? It's really hard for me to take that and sort of run with it and use it in my own project. Yeah, question?
Another particularly motivating case for me when I realized that it was a fun IDE initially.
Yeah.
It was one of the first times I was willing to step out of Emacs to do development.
Yeah.
Was trying to version control and realizing the frequency with which just like different outputs.
Yeah.
And you get merge conflicts.
Oh yeah.
It's the co-location of the result and the text.
Right.
It doesn't always respect line endings.
Yep.
They get really unhappy.
Yep. Or things that like you regenerate an output file and exactly the same, but thinks it's different because of weird.
Or if there's a stochastic element where like it's not really changing, right? And I've tried writing like commit hooks and
oh cool
stuff to try to clean it up.
Yeah.
But that's really not. I'd rather not have to do my development in that type of environment.
Yeah. No, I've seen this a lot when I have students that have repos where we're even like developing a module, but then there's an example notebook that each student isn't, like we're all working on the module together, but each student is using that one notebook to do prototyping, and like all the code is great, but the diffs on that notebook just become incomprehensible. So I usually tell them just to have their own local prototyping notebook, which again is great, but not to think of it as, this like thing that's part of the, part necessarily of the code development process.
And the philosophy that I'm trying to move towards is just realizing the frequency with which, like essentially if I have something that I'm going to write as an algorithm in pseudocode in LaTeX, my goal is to instead have like a cell in the IPython notebook at that level of comprehensibility, where I can say, like for each edge in connectome, right, like Z transform, rather than actually like implementing, because I never in pseudocode like show the way I'm doing the Z transform.
Right.
That functionality exists.
Right.
But I've definitely like totally broken that rule in most of the notebooks that I publish.
Yeah.
That's like what I'm striving towards.
That's cool.
And it saves me time because I don't have to like write pseudocode, because like Python is pretty decent pseudocode if you write it well.
Absolutely. Question? Yeah.
So it all sounds really good, but most people practically have to often figure out whether doing things the right way is actually beneficial for them.
Yep.
Doing the things right way requires extra time. You have to create all those packages. You have to create something to import from your notebook and all that. This will all take time, and I mean, no one's a clairvoyant, so no one will know in the future that I will reuse it, but someone in the lab will reuse it. But at the same time, there are deadlines. I have to publish 27 papers a month, and
Totally.
things.
Totally. It's a lot of
Do you
papers.
have any advice on, like, as a scientist, is there like a rule of thumb whether, you know, if I ask 10 of my coworkers and 5 of them says they would like this module, I should make a module or something like that.
Right, right.
To help decide, should I keep hacking in this notebook, finish it in half an hour, or should I build modules that will take me 2 hours?
Yeah. That's a fantastic question. We talk about that a lot in my group. I talk about it with a lot of people. One of the rules of thumb I use is to actually, in some ways, start just thinking about myself. And I basically ask myself, if I'm working on something, whether I'm writing some big piece of code, some library, or I'm just working in a notebook, I ask myself, has this thing reached a point of complexity where I'm having trouble following what's going on, and it might be easier if I took this piece that I'm sort of struggling with and I just tried to take it out and solve it on its own. Because even forget about sharing, forget about the fact that people want to reuse your modules. I find, especially once I started doing this, it helped me think about how to solve the problem I'm solving if I can take this piece and just kind of pull it out and then just focus on solving that in isolation. And maybe that piece is, I don't know, to be concrete, let's say I'm writing, I don't know, we do a lot with sort of graphics related stuff, sort of interactions between like behavioral control for virtual reality and graphics. And maybe one little piece of the code we're trying to write involves trying to figure out whether a point is inside a polygon. And maybe there's no sort of standalone thing in Python to do that. So that's the kind of situation where often you end up with one of these big beefy cells in the notebook that all it's doing is just solving that problem. And because you're doing it in the context of all this other stuff, and every time you just want to get to that point in the notebook, you have to like run it from the top. So it's getting really time consuming to sort of prototype. That's the moment when I would say it's worth taking this thing you want to solve, just pull it out, even if you just put it into a text editor with a nice little example, we'll talk about this, and you just say, all right, I'm just going to solve this point and polygon problem. So even then, at least then you just have it nicely solved in a well-defined way. You test a few different inputs to make sure your thing is doing the right thing, and then you can go back and use it in your notebook. So I would say that's worth it, even if you don't bother to then package it and make it a nice little package. But of course, if you then think to yourself, well, there's even like 2 other people that might find this useful, then it is worth putting it together. I think another thing is that difference in time that you described, I think we can bring down. So actually, I'm just about done with a little command line tool I wrote to try to make just the process of initializing and publishing a Python package easier. Because coming from NPM, where it's like ridiculously easy, I find Python to be way too. Who here has published a Python package like on PyPy? Okay, cool. And did it seem time consuming?
First time, yes.
Yeah. After that, you sort of get used to it.
Well, there's a lot of templates you can use and stuff.
Yeah.
And if you use some DevOps code, you have your traffics and stuff.
Yeah. So I wrote this little, I can show you, I wrote this little command line tool that basically just like creates a little local template project and then does some of the publishing stuff. NPM is awesome because you basically just type npm init and it creates the skeleton of a package, and then you type npm publish and it publishes it to the registry, which in Python right now is a little bit more complicated.
Ariel's package is kind of nice from that perspective, but that one thing that he has is called Shablona.
Oh, cool. Shablona?
Shablona.
Like that?
Without the R.
Shablona. Oh, cool. Oh, awesome. Ah, yes, I totally saw this. Yep. Yeah, cool. Perfect. Oh, nice. And there's a notebook. Yeah, that's super. Yeah, this is super useful.
This one is cool because it sets out Upfire and Travis CI.
Oh, great.
Package on Mac, Windows, and Linux.
Cool. Yeah, so use this.
And it uses Travis for deploying to PyPy.
Oh, great. Oh, really? That's cool. Oh, awesome.
Actually, so this is one approach is the template. Right?
Yeah.
One other approach is to start is to do it agile, right? So from the very first line of code that you have, make it into a package. Because the first time is very easy. You don't have to think about strings or documentation or Travis even. And then it's just, like you said, it's just the Python set up the py, that's this, and your PyPy password. And if you start from that and keep doing it with every commit, then it feels a little bit less cumbersome
Yep.
and less of a heavy item to do.
Absolutely.
Whenever you start writing a module, just make it into a package.
Yep.
That'll be my advice.
Yep. I completely agree.
Does that conflict with the idea of like playing around in an IPython notebook first?
That's kind of why I am in
Kind of
this class,
does,
because I'm trying to figure out what that sweet spot is for the IPython notebook. Because
Yeah.
the sort of things that you've been mentioning as like disadvantages, that is sort of what is a threshold for me very early on. So yeah.
You're saying you sort of, this is great, so you very quickly in using the notebook want to be back in a proper development environment.
Yeah, modules and tests. And
Yeah.
I write the test and then I figure out how do I test the code that's in my Python notebook.
Yeah.
Or how do I, stuff like that.
Yeah. I'm kind of like that as well. I'll almost always make an example notebook for any of my modules just to have something I think is a little easier for people to see as an example. But especially now, I don't do very much development in the notebook. One way to think about incorporating it that I think is totally valid. One of the amazing things about it is it's very flexible, right? So it can serve a lot of different roles for different people. One great way I think to use the notebook is really to think of it as the thing you do at the very end. Once you've already written a handful of modules that solve different problems, say for a paper or a project or whatever, and then at the very end of all of it, you just want to have a single document that shows how you can sort of chain these different pieces together to actually do a piece of work and probably generate figures, maybe for a paper or not, for post paper. But the idea is to sort of, basically wait and just do that at the end. I think that's wonderful actually. And especially if you've written your modules in a nice way, that's kind of the ideal thing, because then people who are in that notebook can go play around.
Well, it's very much in the spirit of the Substack quote, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Now it's like it's an application.
Yep.
Right? Essentially, it's what can't be abstracted away.
Exactly. Right. So if you just replace, if you just replace this with the Jupyter Notebook, then I think it's totally in line with Substacks.
Or if you think about application as like a scientific application,
right?
It's like as it is.
Exactly. Do you have a question?
Just touched my head.
Oh, great. That's cool too. I totally agree. And I think that that is absolutely a way to think about it. And I find in practice people dart back and forth between these. You might start, you're just prototyping in a notebook, then you sort of realize the problem you're trying to solve. So you go to your module, you create the skeleton, you actually start coding, you write some tests, you finish it. That's a nice little thing. Then you go back to the notebook, and now you import, and you can just do in one line what before was occupying a lot of the notebook. But then maybe things get complicated in another stage.
And abstraction's really powerful. And I assume you'll talk about my binder at some point. But one of the things, recently we put something in my binder to accompany an archive document.
Cool.
And really, I wanted to
yes, I know that.
criticism. Yeah. On Gitter.
Yep.
I really wanted to solicit criticism from statisticians as well as from image processing people.
Right.
I don't think our IPython notebook really is a great example. This is our first time on my binder.
Cool.
But I really wanted to be able to abstract things out, so that a statistician could come in and evaluate one module, but just trust that where we say we load an image, it loads an image appropriately. Right. Or someone who thinks about the overall workflow, for them to just get a bird's eye view and say the sequence in which you've done things makes sense. Right. And to enable, whereas if you just have tons of lines of code, right, you aren't giving someone the choice of how to abstract.
Yeah.
Right? You're requiring them to mine through and repackage things for you.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, I'm just importing this module. If you care to know the details,
then go check it out.
Totally find it.
Exactly.
Right? But if you don't, just trust me that when I say that, I did a t-test, I did a t-test.
Right. No, I completely, it's this thing about you always want to dig, you want to be able to drill down if you need to.
Yeah, you don't just vomit it on the...
But you don't want to vomit, you don't want to vomit out, an enormous amount of, code that sort of no one's going to be able to kind of reuse. And the most powerful thing in some ways about the notebook is if you read a notebook that's doing something kind of like what you're doing, it's wonderful if you can basically just grab that little bit in the one notebook and then apply it to your own problem. But again, if that's copying and pasting code that looks like this, you're probably going to get stuck. Yeah. So I can pull up. I can definitely talk about Binder if people are interested. I can pull up. This is a little bit pithy, but actually, it took a while to sort of get into this rhythm. So we talked a little bit about just like setting up a project for a Python package. If people haven't seen that, we had one example here. And this package looks awesome. So, typically just to set up a Python package, there are a handful of things you need to have in your folder, basically. This is all just sort of, again, this is going to be different for every language. It usually involves, well, you always want to have a README. There's a folder that's usually the name of the top level thing. It has this __ init.py file, and then it has a bunch of other files. You always have to have this setup.py file. You always have to have a license. So this is just sort of like boilerplate, totally uninteresting. This looks like an awesome one for doing a kind of full-blown project because you've got version integrated testing on Travis. You have documentation with Sphinx. That's awesome. I'll pull up this if people are interested. I think I also show. So this is a little bit lower, sort of lighter weight. So this is this tool PIM that you just init and you give it a little bit of information. It's like does a little interview, and then it just creates an even more minimal skeleton. So it's literally just project, the init file, a requirements file, and a setup file. So I just find for some things I don't want all the extra baggage of some of those other things. I just want to get straight to writing my module. But however you set up your project, to me, this is really what I'm talking about here is relevant again to any language. I learned this from another thing that Substack wrote, basically, and just tried to sort of copy his practices. But I think it applies equally well to Python. So it is literally a 5-step process that I go through every single time I write a module. So the very first thing, the most important thing is defining the scope of the problem. And often this comes usually from what you were doing previously. So again, if you're inside a notebook and there's a chunk of the notebook that's getting kind of confusing and you realize that it's a well-defined, isolated problem, like again, point and polygon, or I don't know, some comparison between two arrays, or maybe this sort of dimensionality reduction method. That's sort of, even those span a gamut to some degree of complexity. Point and polygon might be 20 lines of code. This linear algebra or the dimensionality reduction method that Jake wrote is maybe 300 lines of code, but in both cases are reasonably well contained. So it's really about defining the problem. I think the biggest thing to think about there is just how broad or how narrow that problem is. Definitely there is a point at which things are so narrow that if it's just 3 lines of code, you probably don't need to make it a standalone module. I would say especially in Python, just because it is a little bit of extra baggage compared to Node or JavaScript, you probably don't want to write a package that's 3 lines. I may have done it before. Don't tell anyone. In JavaScript, there's just the barrier is so low that you just sort of end up, I don't know, because you're like, even if it's just 3 lines, it's easier to just have a single command, right? It's just a single function. But think about the scope of the problem. There's also a tendency, I think, to have the scope be too large. So if we're saying, my module is going to be the data analysis pipeline for the lab, that's not a great module, right? Because that should really be built out of modules, and it's kind of hard to imagine anyone else is going to use exactly the pipeline you built for your lab, almost by definition. So the next thing I do is basically write an example at the very beginning. And this is the part that I found really unintuitive at the beginning, and most people do, but I find it's really useful, even though it feels kind of weird, which is basically once you've defined the problem, before you write any code, so don't implement anything, write a file, like literally make a file, example.py, that basically uses your code the way you would want it to be used were it to exist. So in other words, if you're, I had one example. If you want to, let's say you're going to write some function that does some kind of estimation or does some kind of fit some model, right? I would literally write a file that says something like I'm going to write a tuning curve example.py. I'll set this somewhere. Let's say I'm going to write a module called tuning that's going to estimate the tuning curve relating to variables. I might literally write a file like this, example.py x, y. Oh, oops. Print b, print r. So this is like absurdly trivial, but it's just to illustrate the point. Make it a little bigger as well. So if I was planning to, write a module called estimate inside of this tuning thing, or a function estimate inside of the tuning module that estimated some relationship, it really doesn't matter, between x and y, the very first thing I would do is write a file like this. So I wouldn't implement any code. I would just write the thing that basically, to me, is what I want when I'm done. And the reason I do this is that what I've learned over the years is that, especially in these like very generic languages, you can implement anything. Anyone can implement anything. Like literally, if you wrote an example file like this, and you said, I needed to implement this thing, and I needed to pass these tests, we can always figure out a way to do it. In some ways, that's not the hard part. It can be, if you get stuck in the weeds and the algorithms get complicated, data structures, whatever, that you can sort of look those things up in books, and it's not that hard. But designing something that is really easy for people to understand and is easy for people to use, in terms of, like, here we're talking about the API basically, designing something that when you import it inside of a notebook, it looks nice and clean and simple and is like easy to tell what the inputs are and what the outputs are, that's the hard part. Implementing it, not a problem. So what I do whenever I'm starting to write a module is I do this first because this is the thing that's really hard and it takes a lot of prototyping, and I'll literally sort of sit there to myself and say, okay, well, this looks kind of nice, but maybe I don't want to estimate these two things at the same time, or maybe what is x and y? Are they going to be arrays? Maybe they should be file names. Should I have this thing load the data from a file? Should I take arrays as inputs? What are the pros and cons? I'll like write I'll say, okay, maybe x and y, instead of being arrays, should be file names. So maybe I'll do like x.csv, maybe they're going to be CSV files, y.csv. And then I'll say to myself, all right, is this better or worse? What are the trade-offs between having the inputs be arrays versus having them be files? And just sort of think through, how is someone going to use this? What are the struggles people are going to deal with? I do all that first, and then when I'm happy with it, and one thing is that here I'm not quite doing that, but your example could actually, just to hint at the concept of unit test, your example can actually, to some minimal degree, make sure that your thing is doing the right thing. And this just makes a really fast feedback loop, because then you can just go to the terminal and just run python example.py once you've implemented it, and then it should do the right thing. So although it's kind of weird, I write the example first. Then, this really should just be implement. Then once I have the example, which does sort of implicitly define the API, then I actually go to implement it. So I make my example, and then I go back to the main code and write all the code that's going to implement the thing. And that part's kind of fun, and it's actually not that hard because it's a really well-constrained problem at that point. And it sort of separates, to me, I like this because it separates sort of creates a division between thinking really hard about the API and thinking about the implementation. And those are, to me, one is sort of a design problem, and the other is a sort of algorithm data structure problem. So I think about that one first, and then I do the implementation. And then the great thing is your example can then be a test. Because if your example included an assertion, the example is a test file that you can then use with Travis and these other things you'll learn about later. And then finally, I version it and I put it on whatever package management system. Are we done, Ariel? Great.
I come bearing happy news. Coffee is upstairs.
Oh, cool. Okay, great.
It's
good.
Gluten sensitive. I have